This is chapter 6 of The Initiate, Some Impressions of a Great Soul. I heard recently, I was watching a foreign film, and somebody said the name Cyril. I've been saying Cyril, but it's Cyril. It's really hard for me to change my brain on that. I've never heard the name before, spoken. So anyways, it's Cyril as far as I know now, not Cyril. And maybe some listeners already knew that. And maybe it's not Cyril. Maybe that's just how they pronounced it. Maybe it's Cyril or something. Anyways, so chapter 6, the name of this chapter is The Figure in the Room. From the foregoing chapter, it will be realized that Justin Morward Hague possessed certain powers which are not to be found in the majority of people, although one is apt to meet them more frequently nowadays than at the time which I write. That they should have astonished me was, of course, to be expected, and also, as a result, that I should have endeavored to probe Hague on the subject was equally to be expected. But that I should induce him to display them to me or others merely to prove their existence, this was quite another matter. Indeed, he even begged me to refrain from spreading abroad in any form whatever my knowledge that he had the power to exercise any faculties outside the ordinary, telling me that when he felt called upon to use one or other of his powers in order to help a fellow creature, the gossip that ensued was far from his liking, and therefore he felt especially desirous it should not be unnecessarily increased. The greatest men on this planet, he would say when discussing the subject, would not make use of their powers even in the harmless way I have done on occasion, though respecting psychometry, it is as comparatively commonplace as playing the piano with adequate dexterity or making a fine speech. As a matter of fact, these powers, and far greater ones in addition, are merely stepping stones whereby the disciple of occult wisdom learns to acquire faith. And I refer to that most valuable species of faith which gives him the encouragement to pursue his way along the very difficult pathway of final emancipation. An adept in occult science will for this reason teach his students some of these so-called miraculous powers, but as to demonstrate them to humanity at large, he would never dream of doing such a thing. It would be neither ethical, wise, nor safe, for humanity is not ready for them as yet. One day, when we were together with a few other interested students, encouraging Morward to expound the mysteries of his occult science, the question arose as to the possibility of reading other people's thoughts, and also the permissibility of so doing, when the faculty had been developed. And in answer to this question, Morward told us a story which, had it come from the lips of anyone else, were hardly believable in the extreme luridness of its villainy. I must, of course, adopt fictitious names, he began, as one or other persons connected with the matter are probably still alive, and certainly the chief figure in this story, a student of mine, is not only so, but even living in London at the present moment. Well, it all happened when this student was undergoing the process known as waking up. That is to say, his latent psychic faculties were beginning to come into manifestation, but he had so far not learned how to exercise proper control over them. We will call him Sinclair for our present purpose, and I must tell you he was a man of very powerful physique and some 38 years of age. The other persons connected with this little drama were 3 in number, namely 2 brothers whom we will call respectively Henry and Charles Thompson, and a woman we will call Ethel Thompson, in that she was Henry's wife. Now, this man Henry was by no means happily married, and the world was perfectly aware of the fact, for neither he nor Ethel possessed the faculty of dissembling beyond a display of the most frigid politeness in front of other people, a politeness more significant, in fact, than occasional open discord. Moreover, it was known that Henry took drugs, driven to them, gossip declared, by his wife's ill temper and general unpleasantness, though I think, if truth be told, it was more owing to his own neurotic temperament than any doing of hers. Well, Henry was the elder brother, and through his father's will possessed a considerable property. embracing a beautiful country estate, a large house in town, plenty of spare cash in addition, and all of which, according to the will, would pass on to the younger brother in the event of his death. Why his wife, under these circumstances, did not urge a separation is, of course, easy to divine, for as it was said by her so-called friends, she had married him for his money, and it was hardly likely she would break with him and thus lose a large part of the object of her marriage. There is also another reason why she avoided a separation, for this man, with all his wealth, was deplorably mean, and she knew full well that to live apart from him was to live apart from his riches and be reduced to an allowance which would be anything but bountiful. Indeed, he, in his parsimony, was on his side quite averse to making her any separation allowance at all, and preferred to put up with her and her tantrums rather than permit her to make use of money for the maintenance of any household in which he did not participate. Such, indeed, is the nature of meanness. It would rather buy misery with its money than nothing at all. As to Charles Thompson, he felt that species of contempt for his brother which the man of a certain kind of strong physique, combined with strong physical desires and appetites, feels towards the weak. He regarded his neurotic brother as a disgrace to the family tree, and, being at the same time envious of his inheritance, although for many reasons he found it convenient to keep in with him, yet in his heart he hated and despised him. Nor were these reasons far to seek, for by keeping up friendly relations with his brother, Charles was enabled from time to time to enjoy the luxuries and also the amusements, shooting, hunting, etc., afforded by wealth and a large estate. As to Sinclair, his interest in this family was purely altruistic, based upon an old association with Henry, for they had been schoolfellows together to begin with, and then Oxford undergraduates later. Henry, in fact, liked Sinclair as much as it were possible for a man of so mean a nature to like anybody, and Sinclair, hoping to achieve some little widow's mite of good for him, fostered the friendship instead of permitting it to die what would otherwise have been a natural death. The utterly villainous incident I am going to relate occurred at the Thompsons' country estate while Sinclair and Charles Thompson were guests together in the house. They were the only guests at the time, for the effects of Henry's drug-taking were becoming more and more apparent, and his wife was chary of inviting others to witness so degrading a spectacle. Charles Thompson and Sinclair were thus left a good deal together. They walked, they rode out, or sat reading over the fire, and at all other times, when Ethel Thompson was too busy with her own affairs to be present with them, and Henry himself too restless in mind and body to attach himself to the company of others. And then it was that Sinclair found himself confronted with a rather strange feeling of mind, for whenever he was left alone with Charles, and they were not actually conversing, a certain picture began to present itself to his imagination, and a very horrible picture it was. True, the first time he became conscious of it, there was a vagueness of outline and detail which caused him to dismiss the whole thing from his mind as one of those foolish imaginative daydreams which are liable to intrude themselves into our more negatively meditative states of consciousness. But when, as the time went on, it persisted, growing more definite and detailed, he became forcibly alive to the fact that it must bear some strange, if not evil, significance. For he noticed another thing which might be connected with it, that whenever he himself was particularly conscious of its intrusion, Charles, his companion, was especially distrait, or staring into space with concentrated expression of face. Another factor gradually became sensible to his imaginative senses, a feeling of intense hatred and cunning, which, try as he would, he was unable to banish from his consciousness. But the picture, we asked, interrupting the story, what was it? Well, it was the picture of Charles Thompson standing by Ethel's bedside, smothering her with a pillow, and then pouring the contents of a little blue bottle down her throat. We all gave way to some ejaculations. That was part of the picture, he continued. The rest of it you will see later, for to tell you now would spoil the story. Well, 3 days went by, and this murderous picture obtruded itself more and more on Sinclair's consciousness, until it seemed almost an obsession, bringing him finally to the conviction that he was confronted not with a mere thought, but actually with a most diabolical intention. And yet, how to act? That was the problem which faced his tortured mind. For to accuse this man of intending to murder his sister-in-law was hardly feasible, not to say highly inadvisable into the bargain. Indeed, as you will be asking yourselves, what possible object could this man have in getting rid of Ethel? I must tell you that the bulk of the money did not fall to her at his brother's death, but to Charles himself. Nobody could have the slightest reason to suppose that Charles and Ethel were not on friendly terms. Rather had it been rumored by some that Charles was of late inclined to pay her a little more attention than was altogether conventional for a brother-in-law. There was one course, however, he felt he might try, and that was to warn Ethel he had a dreadful presentiment concerning her, and beg her to be specially on her guard, or, better still, to make some excuse and return to London immediately. But, unfortunately, here he was confronted not only with a very matter-of-fact woman who looked upon all occult feelings with that indulgent contempt born of complete ignorance of the subject, but also a woman of intense obstinacy. The moment he threw out even a hint in that direction, it was treated with good-natured scorn, and he himself accused of indulging in old maidish superstitions and long-exploded fancies, while, as to her taking the advice he had intended to offer, of this he saw so little chance that he gave up at once the intention and let the matter rest. One thing he did attain by broaching the subject to her, and that was a deeper conviction of the nefarious intentions of Charles Thompson. For Ethel, by way of chaffing Sinclair, introduced the matter into the dinner-table conversation, and he was thus in a position to perceive what effect was by that means brought about, the effect being exactly as he had expected. It was that the unsuspecting eye of Ethel and Henry detected nothing, for the simple reason they were looking for nothing. But to the alert eyes of Sinclair himself, Charles's discomfort was convincingly manifest. I have already told you that Ethel and Henry were not on good terms. You will not be surprised to learn they occupied separate rooms, and rooms that were not adjoining, but almost at opposite extremes of the house. On this particular occasion, Sinclair's room was next to Mrs. Thompson's, and Charlie's midway between hers and that of her husband, all the rooms being on the same floor and leading out of one long corridor. Sinclair, in his ever-growing conviction of impending murder, could induce Mrs. Thompson to lock her door at night, was of course out of the question, seeing the manner in which she had already greeted his presentiments, so along the line of even that slight precaution he knew any argument was useless. But in place of it, he did what will seem to be this stage of our story a very strange and irrelevant thing. He began to rack his brains for some means to induce Henry to leave the house and leave it for several days on end. But Henry Thompson's life was not threatened. wasn't threatened, we interrupted variously. That is just the strange part of the story, but wait and see, was his patient but puzzling answer. Well, the first idea that suggested itself was to arrange with some friend in London to send Henry a bogus telegram demanding his presence on some pretext or other, and one which would detain him for some considerable time. But naturally, such a pretext was very difficult to find, so much so that Sinclair was soon compelled, on reflection, to give up the idea. As to falling back on the unfertile procedure of imploring Henry to leave the house, merely because the presentiment of danger for him was in his own mind, this, he knew, would be as useless in the case of Henry as it had been in the case of his wife. There was, in the end, only one thing that he could do, and that was simply to wait and to watch, passing, of course, utterly sleepless nights at his unlatched door, listening for Charles's footsteps creeping stealthily towards Ethel's bedroom. And yet, even in doing this, he still saw danger to Ethel's life. For should he prevent Charles from entering that room, which would not be a difficult matter, yet he would have no plausible evidence for accusing him of murderous intentions. As to letting him actually enter, and, by following, catch him in the very act of smothering her, there was always the possibility he might lock the door, and, on a disturbance being created, hide behind the lesser evil of pretended adultery. Well, for 3 nights, Sinclair spent the long hours in what seemed an endless vigil, and yet nothing whatever happened. He had taken his armchair and placed it by the door, which he closed to the extent of making its appearance from the outside such as to lead anyone to suppose it were latched. Having arranged this, he sat in such a position that his ear was against the crack, and he was enabled to hear the least sound in the passage. It was upon the 4th night, and, worn out with sleeplessness, he must, as he puts it, have fallen into a sort of doze, when he became aware of what seemed like a voice speaking from within his own head, yet in some strange way exterior to himself. It said in a tone of command, "Wake up and act." Opening his eyes with a start of horror, lest his lapse should have cost Ethel her very life, he looked up and saw, standing in front of him, a figure, and it was the figure of a man he knew. "You must save the 3, it seemed to command. Creep into her room, lie down out of sight behind the further side of the bed, and then wait. Close your door and her door. Be quick, but silent." It was a work of a minute to carry out this behest, and when he entered Ethel's room, he could hear by her breathing she was unsuspectingly in the deepest sleep of the night. Fortunately, there was a full moon, and he could discern all the objects in the bedroom, and so was in no danger of bumping against some chair or table and thus waking her up. And so very stealthily he crept towards the far side of the bed as he had been directed, and lay down on the floor to wait. 5 minutes or 10 minutes it may have been that he lay listening to what cheap novelists would call the throbbing of his own heart against his breast, and then at length he heard the door open very quietly and close again. Footsteps approached the other side of the bed, and then the dull thud of a down pillow clapped over somebody's face. A few seconds, and he had rushed around, flung himself on Charles from behind, knocked the little blue bottle onto the floor, while Ethel herself whipped the pillow from her face, suddenly sitting up in bed with the intensity of the shock and force of her utter bewilderment. What precisely happened immediately afterwards, Sinclair finds it difficult to remember, for he was engaged in both a struggle with bodies and a struggle with words, his first endeavor being to prevent Charles from rushing out of the room before Ethel could discover who he was. What he did remember was a confused medley of 3 voices, all asking the same question at once, and Ethel jumping out of bed and switching on the light. He found himself disengaged from Charles and standing with his back guarding the door, imploring them both to abate their voices so as not to wake the servants and cause a scandal. Well, you can imagine what followed. Charles, finding himself cornered, tried to bluff, and did it exceedingly badly. On Ethel indignantly demanding what it all meant, the pillow with which someone had tried to smother her, and the bottle of laudanum on the floor, he immediately turned on Sinclair and accused him of attempting murder. He had heard a slight noise and, thinking there must be burglars in the house, had come out into the passage just in time to see Sinclair going into Ethel's room, and so he had followed. This was the lie which he attempted to thrust upon her. But Sinclair was equal to the occasion. He rushed for the pillow, which had fallen on the floor, and held it with his arms like a vice. "It won't work," he said. "This pillow is out of the red room. That room is Charles's, and red room is marked on it. That bottle is out of Henry's room, which is next to yours, and you stole it from his bedside. Deny it if you can. Henry can easily be called to prove it." Then Charles tried to bluff again. "Good God, man," he cried, "what possible object could I have for murdering my sister-in-law? Do you suppose that any jury is going to believe that damned nonsense? You accused me a moment ago of attempting murder attempting to murder her, yet I could have no possible object whatever. The family money would certainly not pass to me at her death, was Sinclair's calm rejoinder. And do you suppose it would pass to me, you fool? He snarled. Why, if I was going to murder anybody for money, it would have been my brother. It was your brother, said Sinclair very slowly. You were going to murder your sister-in-law so that your brother should be hanged for it. Then Charles collapsed, and here Morward paused for a moment as if to recollect the remainder of the story, if any remainder there was. But I don't quite understand, said one of us. I don't quite see the connection between the pillow and the laudanum. You will understand when I have explained what happened afterwards, he replied, smiling. Ethel was not an emotional woman. Emotional women are not given to marrying men for their money. On the contrary, she was a cold and hard specimen of her sex, and so she neither had hysterics nor showed any special signs of fear. She was merely furious, with the fury born of so-called righteous indignation. She wanted justice, but she did not want to take revenge because she was very loath to have it known that she possessed any relationship whatever with a murderer. It was very evident to her at once that Charles was guilty of something particularly dastardly, because the contrast between the manner of the two men was all too evident. But until Sinclair explained to her the whole train of sinister circumstances which led him to act as he did in the effort of saving her, she was not convinced of the utter villainy of her brother-in-law. The picture which Sinclair had seen in its entirety, for you will remember I only represented it to you in part, was the image of Charles stealing into Henry's room while he was in one of those sound sleeps which only drugs can produce, removing his bottle of laudanum and then smothering Ethel with a pillow and finally pouring the poison down her own throat. That was the first part of the picture, but the second was a scene in the law courts which Henry in the dock being committed for the murder of his wife and eventually hanged. Whether this would really have been the final result and an innocent man condemned in place of the guilty one is hard to say. Certainly, Henry and Ethel were known to live together in almost open discord. Charles had paid marked attentions to her of late, in order to give further apparent reasons for Henry to murder her, namely, out of jealousy, and thus, if Sinclair had not intervened, it is more than probable that one of the most horrible tragedies of modern times would have ensued. What did occur, however, was fortunately of an entirely different nature, for Sinclair subsequently convinced both Ethel and Henry of Charles's guilt, and he was finally persuaded to leave the country in exchange for a promise that no proceedings would be taken against him. And that ends my story of the attempted murder of two innocent people for the love of possession, which is the mother of many tragedies. And yet not quite the end, said one of us, for you have not told us who was the figure in the room. The figure in the room, said Morward reflectively, that, I think, is of little consequence. Why, bless my soul, surely that is half the story. Can I rely on your discretion? He asked earnestly. We gave our assurance. Well then, I was the figure in the room.